Mark chapter 12 at work. And we're going to be looking at verses 13 through 17 this morning. So Mark chapter 12, verses 13 through 17. And looking and understanding a life lived in tension. A life lived in tension. And honestly, that's the life not just of us sometimes, but also a lot of the things that are objects that are in our lives, like a suspension bridge. Right? We look at a suspension bridge and we realize that's a life lived in tension, and it's actually a good thing. Maybe one of the most notable examples of that is actually the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, California. We see that bridge, and honestly one of the most iconic suspension bridges, not just the United States, but really the world. It's kind of universally recognized. You can put that like a silhouette up for somewhere, and everybody instantly recognizes, oh, that's the Golden Gate Bridge. And you realize how old that bridge actually is. It was first conceived in 1917. It was finally completed in 1937. At the time, it truly was an engineering and modern marvel. It was the longest type of bridge at the time. It was also the tallest bridge of that type at the time. And people were, flocked to see it and to use it. And it was an amazing thing, but it's a life lived in tension. And that's how it works, because it's suspended. There's the suspension, but part of that suspension is the tension. So gravity then pulls that road deck down and holds it there. So that constant tension and traffic and things can go across it. But the cables, of course, are pulling the opposite direction and more or less holding it. And because they're in balance or tension, it works and becomes a usable object. It becomes a usable thing. Now, we can overcome one or the other. If we start to weigh down, either if we could just have a gravity on the dial and tune it up a little bit and have that gravity increase, pull the deck down, we could have a catastrophic failure. We can put too much traffic on it, have a catastrophic failure. But we can even have the cables and play with those, and where they start to give way, where they're not able to pull up with the same tenacity that they currently have, and they begin to break and everything starts failing and falling. And from time to time we see things like that get out of whack, not necessarily with the Golden Gate Bridge, but other examples where there's engineering disasters, and it's very destructive. When we try to learn from those things, like what happened, what upset the balance that we thought we had, that we were trying to maintain. And sometimes we can figure that out and make improvements based on those things. But it's a great way to understand that tension can actually be a good thing. Typically, when we think of tension, especially in our own personal lives, we do whatever we possibly can to remove it. We always think of it as being a bad thing rather than a balancing thing. And sometimes we do need to look at things like this and see they're actually a balancing things. And that's a great understanding for the Christian life, and how harmony is possible and can be maintained in the Christian's life, especially when it comes to Christian and government. There's often a tension there. It's not necessarily one that we can just relieve, nor should we seek to. More often than that, that harmony is interrupted or in a state of interruption, and so it becomes difficult to maintain that or even to want to maintain that. And honestly, to think that there's a harmony there seems almost laughable, because it's rarely really truly existed throughout history. And even when it does, it's so short-lived and so temporary, it seems like, that it just evaporates. And that's not actually possible. But some balance is. Not always, but sometimes it is possible. And that's what we should be striving for. But it is to live a life lived in tension. And there is actually a benefit in the balance that I'll try to show and articulate for us today. But we need to consider this morning, how can I live well in one kingdom while being a citizen in another? That's always been the million-dollar question when it comes to the lives of Christians. Like, how can I do this? How can I do this well? Because it feels often impossible. And sometimes it is. Sometimes it is. But how can I do this? And so what we're going to find here is Jesus engaging in a test of loyalty from the Pharisees, and then also a way to, he's going to articulate a way to maintain some harmony. But in order to be a good citizen, we need to render to each the tribute that each one is due. And this is actually going to be a theme that we're going to continue for the next several weeks, Lord willing, because this morning we're looking at the question the Pharisees are going to present to Jesus. Next week, Lord willing, we'll see the question that the Sadducees are presenting to Jesus. And then following that, the scribes are presenting a question to Jesus. But it all revolves around this idea of how can we be a good citizen in these various aspects of life that we are falling into. And he's going to answer those questions for each and every one of us as we look at this. But as we get started this morning and consider this test of loyalty that Jesus is about to face, we want to read about it first. Let's look at verses 13 and 14 of Mark chapter 12. And it says this, "And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. And they came and they said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" It's a test of loyalty. And really what this amounts to is a hunting party. That's really what this amounts to. This whole discourse that we're about to read, verses 13 through 17, it's not an honest question and answer time at all. Don't be fooled by that. This is not a pursuit of information innocently, or it's not that at all. This is hostile. This is a hostile interaction. And the they that it's talking about here, they in verse 13, is almost certainly the Sanhedrin, this larger religious governing body that Jesus has been interacting with in the last couple of weeks. It's almost certainly them. And now we have this individual faction. The Pharisees and the Herodians are coming now to talk to Jesus and ask this question, which is odd because they're working together. And you have to understand who the Herodians are. We've interacted with the Pharisees plenty of times, but who are these Herodians? And we don't know a lot about them, but what we do know is the Pharisees and Herodians were not friends. It's one of those rare occurrences when the Democrats and the Republicans can work together on something and get something done, and you're like, what's going on here? Right? And you're like, it's kind of like that. It's kind of like that. They don't like each other, a lot. And they stand for something very, very different, these two groups that we're looking at here. They're not friends. And what's actually bringing them together is the common enemy of Jesus. They both see him as a threat, so they're joining up together to conquer the larger of the two enemies from each other. But the Herodians themselves were really this political party, not a religious, but a political party that sympathized with Herod, thus the name Herodians. But even Herod was a sympathizer with Rome, so they were really for Rome, and that's where they received their power. That's what they wanted to do. The Pharisees, on the other hand, they hated the Romans. It's not their thing, and that's not who they're going for. They hated the occupation. They hated everything about this arrangement. But it just shows Jesus is so polarizing that he winds up uniting everybody together with somebody. He brings enemies together, and he brings believers and Christians together, but he brings everybody. But it's true what Jesus said, you are either for me or against me. And here we find even enemies coming together, uniting in a common cause against Christ. He brings everybody together. And I'm calling this a hunting party. It uses the word here, specifically trap him, in verse 13. I'm going to call it a hunting party because that's what they're up to. They're trying to trap Jesus and something that he says. This is not a relaxing kind of a situation or hunt. Some of you have just come off the hunting week and for the last few weeks, maybe, I don't know if bow season's still a thing right now or not, but you're out there, you just enjoy it. Maybe we'll get something, maybe not. We'll just enjoy some time in the woods, look at the beauty of God's creation. Maybe we get something, maybe we don't. It's not that kind of a hunting party. It's a manhunt. It's the violent pursuit of someone that they want to catch and ensnare with something, with the goal of bringing them down, as if what you would do with a wanted criminal. That's what they're doing. And their goal is to discredit him or disgrace him. They don't care which one. They discredit him with the people if he sides with the Pharisees. They'll disgrace him if he sides with the Herodians. They don't care, but they want to nail him. Either one will work. And it brings us to what this tricky trap really is. And I know that sounds like something Dora the Explorer would say, the tricky trap. And my 5-year-old was running around my office just before I wrote this, so this probably had some influence. But that's really what this amounts to be. It is a tricky trap. They're looking to ensnare Jesus with one of those gotcha-style questions. Our society as a whole loves those. The kinds of questions that are honestly just dismissive of a person and their standpoint. Their goal is not to discover and find the truth. Their goal really is just to silence someone, to bring them down. Many years ago, I used to listen to a radio program out in Philadelphia, and it was hosted by Michael Smerconish, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, but this one phrase he used, I think I may have only heard him say it once, but it just always stuck with me. But he says, never write when you can speak, never speak when you can nod, never nod when you can wink, and I always add to that, never wink when you can just say nothing. Why? Because we live in a world and a society that loves to play that gotcha too. They will use anything that you have ever said or written or winked at or whatever else against you. And they don't care if they take it out of context. They don't care if they're misunderstanding it. They don't care if you've grown and matured since then. They will take something that you said forever ago, and they will try in whatever way they can possibly do that to take you down and make you and dismiss your argument and dismiss what you're saying, even if has nothing related to what you said or stood for in the past. past. They don't care. They're trying to dismiss you as a person, not deal with your argument, not deal with the things that you're teaching or you're saying or that you're now standing for. And we need to be careful here of ourselves, because we can be guilty of the very same thing. We become dismissive of something. Somebody comes to us and maybe we disagree on something. Are you actually listening to the things that they're saying? Or you just become dismissive of them and say, well, no, because you stand for this, or you've done this in the past, or we become dismissive, instead of hearing the argument, listening to the things that they're saying and interacting with them. Because when you become dismissive of them, guess what? They're going to be dismissive of you. You'll never get anywhere. You want to have meaningful conversation. You want to have gospel conversation. You want to get down to the truth, because you have to be able to converse. You have to have conversations that sometimes can be difficult and sometimes even ugly. But if you want to have those conversations and get somewhere, you can't be dismissive. You have to engage with the person, interact, actually hear them. And say, okay, this is what I think you're saying. Let's go here. Let's talk about this. We have to be doing that. The Pharisees were not doing that with Jesus. They're being dismissive of everything, and they're just trying to trap him with this gotcha kind of a statement and say, we want to get rid of you because we don't want to listen to you, dismiss you, get rid of you. And that's what they're attempting to do. And as they're doing so, they're getting Jesus ready. They're buttering him up, because everything in 14 is flattery. And it's one of those things that it's flat. Everything they say is true, and yet it's a lie. It's like one of those weird, you can actually have a true lie, like sort of. And the reason they say it, because everything they say is true, but they don't believe a word of it. For all intents and purposes, they're lying, even though they're speaking the truth. They think they're lying. They don't believe any of this, because if they did, they would be true followers of Christ. They don't believe this stuff. But the reason they do it is to get Jesus to let his guard down even just a little bit. It's not going to work, but they're going to try. But here's finally the question. Here's what we've been waiting for. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them? Or should we not? It feels like it's a yes or no question. I think it's supposed to feel that way. But you quickly realize, you can't really just answer it that way. It's one of those situations too, especially because of the faction where, and you can even do this at work. Sometimes you realize what somebody is up to. They're saying something. They're trying to bait you into something. And sometimes I think that the best response is just simply say, is this question safe for me to answer? Is it safe for me to answer to this to you, or are you going to try and use this against me no matter what I say? I think that's a great caveat, a great way to kind of start in something and just kind of let them know, I know what you're doing. Is this safe? Or would I be better off just not saying a word because you don't really care what I have to say? You just want to try to hurt me with it. Is it safe? This question for Jesus certainly wasn't safe, but he does know how to answer it. But not every question can just be answered with a simple yes or no. One commentator asked, it's kind of like asking someone, hey, are you still beating your wife? And you're like, that feels like a yes or no question. And yet, if I say yes, and I'm not, hopefully that's not true, but if I say no, then it feels like, well, I used to be. So, it's not a yes or no question. It feels like it, but it could easily be used in a situation like a gotcha. It's not that simple. Now, nobody likes taxes. I don't think. Anybody? I can give you my W-2 if you'd like, and transfer those. Nobody likes taxes. I don't think that's any kind of a news flash or anybody else. But this isn't just any tax that they're bringing up here. We don't necessarily come across it in our translations, but there was a very specific tax they're asking about. The word, the idea behind that is simply a poll tax, a census tax. It was a tax that was paid simply because you were a person living in that area. You lived and breathed here, you pay this tax. Everybody did. All the parents, the children, everybody had to pay this, or had to be paid on their behalf. And they hated it because it was a reminder to each and every one of them that they're under the thumb of the Roman government. There's nothing you can do. And this didn't serve any purpose. It wasn't like paving roads. It wasn't maintaining the peace. It was simply a tax that went immediately and directly into the Roman coffers just because that's what they wanted to do. You can imagine how infuriating and difficult that must be for all of them. They chafed under it. They hated it. And if Jesus says, go ahead and pay it, he'll look like a traitor to his own people. And if he says no, he's going to look like an insurrectionist in the eyes of the Roman government. and they'll take care of them. At the end of the day, it's one of those, we gotcha. Except they don't. But at the end of the day, we realize this is a test of Jesus' loyalty. Are you pro-Rome or pro-Israel? Are you pro-God or are you pro-pagan? The stakes couldn't be higher. And for if it was any of us, honestly, probably not being able to think that quickly on our feet, we would be trapped. We'd be like, I don't know what to do here. But Jesus isn't trapped. He's going to actually take and use this and make this into a teachable moment for all of us and show us how this tension can actually exist in harmony. And loyalty can be maintained to both. Now again, it's not always possible. But here it is. So verses 15 through 17. Let's read those. But knowing their hypocrisy, and he said to them, why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. And they brought one. And he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. And Jesus said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. And how to maintain loyalty. And Jesus begins exposing the flaw in some of their logic here. And as they said, Jesus is not swayed by appearances. And he's by no means swayed by the appearance of this quote-unquote question or even their questioning of him. He knows exactly what they're doing. Why are you testing me? You know, the goal of anyone when they're testing, whether it's in science or even in the classroom or whatever, it's to learn something. You're gaining information. You're seeking something to gain an understanding and an appreciation of where someone's coming from or where they're at. And we keep finding the Pharisees have been testing Jesus and testing Jesus and testing Jesus, and they learn nothing. They never learn anything. They're never coming away changed and different. Rather than considering the things that Jesus is saying, they're always trying to be dismissive. They're always trying to bring them down. They're not actually trying to learn or do anything. They don't do that. And this is another case in point. But looking at this poll tax, and here's the brilliance and beauty of what Jesus does here. It was paid with a Roman coin, a denarius, and it was a common laborer's wage. If we were to kind of consider how much it might be worth, it was, if you take someone that maybe making minimum wage $7.25 an hour, you multiply that by 8 hours a day for us anyway, just under $60. So you can imagine the value of that. Not nothing. It was significant, a laborer's wage, a common laborer's wage. That's how much this tax was per person. He says, bring me this denarius, bring me this piece of money. Because apparently he wasn't carrying one, but they sure were. And he says, what's on it? Whose face is on it? And of course they reply, well, it's Caesar's. It's not uncommon, even for us, all of our money, they had their Caesars, we have the various presidents of our past on all our coins and all our money. We can see that people that were important in the founding of our country, they did much the same thing. But above this particular one was this inscription. It was Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus. Now if you think about that for even just a moment, you realize Tiberius, son of God. It was a claim of divinity. It was a claim of divinity. I am here, Tiberius, son of God. And the other side had on it a woman, probably his mother. Let's debate on that. And just said high priest. So this is what's on this coin that they're supposed to be coming around and carrying with them and paying this tax with. And here it is. It's a coin that's at the same, it's blasphemous, son of God, this person, son of God, and idolatrous. It's now a graven image of someone claiming to be God on their coin. And here the Pharisees seem to be anyway carrying this thing around, probably even into the temple. And they have this, and this is what they're doing. And then Jesus makes probably what is the most well-known statement of all, and what R. Kent Hughes and many others call the single most influential political statement ever made in the history of the world. That's a significant statement in and of itself. But Jesus is here both signifying this legitimacy of the Roman government, and yet understanding and highlighting the fact that and yet there are limits to that. Render to God the things that are God's. See, what's amazing about this and what Jesus does here is that this Roman coin could be given to Caesar, but it could not be given to God. It could not be given to God. He won't take it. How do you know that? Well, it was not acceptable tender. You ever get one of those Canadian coins, like the one that's the size of a quarter? You get one of those, and then you try to pass it off because nobody else wants it. And I know it's worth something, but like the vending machines, they always kick it back. They always seem to know. And the only thing you can really do is like when your kids lose a tooth or something, you slip it under their pillow and just, oh, it's a money, and then you're just going to lose it anyway. So that's a great way to get rid of it. Little tip for you. But otherwise, you get that, and you're like, it's money, but what am I supposed to do with this? Like, nobody will take it. Nobody wants it. And here, when you take this Roman coin, you realize God's not going to take it either. It's not acceptable tender. That's why when Jesus was in the temple, remember, he's setting the animals free, and he was turning over the tables of the money changers. That's what they were doing. They would take those Roman coins, and arguably coins from anywhere else that you happen to have, because the temple, when you went to pay the temple tax, you could only pay with a shekel that came from Tyre. It was the closest to the Old Testament shekel that there was. It was the only form of payment acceptable. You could not take this Roman coin bearing the face and image of Caesar and pay the temple tax. God's not going to take it. So give back to Caesar his coin. God doesn't want it. But here's the other bit of brilliance here. The coin we know belongs to Caesar because it bears his image. And whoever's image it bears, that's to whom it belongs. Not everyone has a Roman coin, but all of humanity bears the image of God. So give to God the things that are God's. That means you understand that regardless of whether you even believe that God exists or not, that God has already made a claim on your life. And we know this is so because in Genesis 1:26 it says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness.'" That's talking about humanity. That all of us, as part of the human race, is made in the image of God. We belong to Him. He rules over us. Now, not everybody likes that, of course. But when has that really ever mattered? Render to Caesar his due. Pay the tax, but don't render anything more. You don't bear his image. Don't give him the worship that he's calling for. Worship is God's alone. And so harmony can be maintained. Here's how we restore the balance then. Because again, we're running into this question, but how can a Christian live in a world that is not his home? And the answer really is just carefully. Christians have wrestled with this for centuries, or maybe even millennia. Like, how do I do this? And it really depends on the context in which we live. Everyone is unique. And what helps a bit, though, is to remember the role that each one plays, God and government, in a person's life. We often say that God is good, and He is. We rarely think that government is good. And yet at some level we have to admit that it is. Not good in the same way, but still good nonetheless. And Christians find themselves living with a foot in two different worlds. We find ourselves living with a foot in the world and what we see, the physical place in which we dwell and where we make our home, regardless of where that happens to be in the world. But we also have a foot in the kingdom of heaven, a kingdom of God, where we become and acknowledge we're citizens of heaven, citizens of another place. How do we find that balance? And it can be hard because it's under tension, like all the time. But God is the one that established governments. We remember that they derive their authority from God. And they do a good in the world, even when they leave a lot to be desired. It was even part of the conversation that Jesus had with Pilate as he's standing before them, and Pilate makes a comment, "Don't you realize who I am and I have the power and authority over you?" And what is Jesus' comment? "Only because someone greater than you gave it to you." He's referring to his Father. He's referring to God. God gave this to you. We understand that government is a good thing, even though it's a difficult thing. But anarchy in and of itself, it never survives. No government does sound kind of nice sometimes, doesn't it? If we're honest, especially tax time, but other times too. It does sound nice, but we understand too, without that we would have no military to govern our borders, to allow us to have, that we would not be conquered by anyone else. We would not have any infrastructure, that the roads and the bridges and other things that we enjoy on a daily basis and don't think anything up, they wouldn't be there. We would not know peace. We would not have police. We would not have a rule by law or consumer protections. Or when injustices were done, we would have no one to plead our causes to and our cases to. There would be no government there. Can they be abused? All the time. And yet we can still say that they are good. They are good. And it allows us to be able to have the freedom that when we walk away from our homes during the day, we expect to come home to them and find all their things still there. That is the role of some aspects of government. And even Rome, with all of its faults, provided roads. It provided peace. It provided law and justice and other things that allowed people to thrive, to do well. It allowed the gospel to go out relatively safely and disseminated across the empire that was then there. No. Was it perfect? No. Rome committed terrible atrocities against humanity itself and against Christians specifically. They did some terrible things. But we also have to consider that Rome itself was transformed by the Christians that lived in it as they sought to live out and honor Christ first. And they were taking notice. We didn't have a chance to get this far even in Sunday school, but one of the quotes that I have is by one of the emperors later on, just before Constantine, but he was talking about the fact that the Christians made such a difference in Rome. And they said people were leaving paganism and going and following after the Christian God, because he said the Christians, they care about everybody. They're doing all these things. They're making a dent, and they're transforming the society and the whole of the Roman world. And he hated the idea, and yet he couldn't argue because he said, look what they're doing. They're living out their faith. And it caused even the emperor to notice, and that Rome ultimately, at the end of the day, was better for it, not worse. But people sometimes also go to the opposite extreme, not Christians but others, and think, well, no God seems awful kind of nice too. What if we could just have all government? We could just govern and rule ourselves and no God whatsoever, full-on atheism. And there are a growing number of people, especially in the Western world, that find that logic attractive. That they think they can have this, and yet we also see that it brings up dire consequences. You lose morality. You lose peace, both internal and external. You lose human dignity and restraint and what we call the sacred center, realizing things come from something higher than ourselves, something better than ourselves. They disappear. Not overnight, but they do go. I read a bit of a book summary on a book called Dominion. I think it's got a longer title, but that's the gist of it. And by a man by the name of Tom Holland, who I think would claim to be a Christian. I don't have any reason to believe that he actually is. But I think we claim to be, or at least kind of like sympathetic towards them now. He was full-on atheist. He's not any longer, but I don't think he's a Christian either. But he just details how much Western society as a whole has been influenced and changed by Christianity. And what we find going on in the world around us right now is just the logical conclusion of what happens when you throw God out. It's just been delayed. And I've adopted the ideas of what Nietzsche said, Friedrich Nietzsche, over 100 years ago. You know, Friedrich Nietzsche, probably the most famous of his statements is simply that God is dead. God is dead. We killed him and rejoiced in that fact. And yet at the same time, he feared it because he realized he knew what that meant, because everything built on the understanding that there is a God will fall with it. It just won't be instantly. And that's what we have going on in the world around us. And he was honest with that. And people thought, no, that's ridiculous. We can still have morality. We don't have to have God, but we can still have morality. We can still have human dignity. And he's argued, no, you can't. Because when you throw God out, you lose everything else that's built upon God and based upon God. And he predicted if God were dead, it would be a very bloody century. And indeed it has been. How many genocides have we witnessed? With the Holocaust and countless others. How many world wars have we experienced? And other wars besides those. Abortion becoming such a main area of focus, not just here, but across the Western civilized world. Because humans no longer have dignity. We don't even know how to define life. And we've taken so much of it. People have tried to kill God through military might and even academic might here in this country, and trying to shame people. But we are the ones who have died, not God. We need the balance, and Jesus gives us balance, and there's always that wrestling for that. And we wonder, how can that work? But it is. Any time that either one of those things goes out of whack, where the church, and I use that term very, very loosely, where the church becomes too big, becomes a government in and of itself, it eventually falls because it begins pursuing power more so than it does God and Christ, and it falls apart and it breaks, and we've seen that. Anytime the governments become bigger and greater, the human atrocities and things that follow become greater and greater and greater. They break. They break. It doesn't work. We need that tension there. We need the balance, because the government comes and proceeds from Christianity or from Christ and from God and maintains a balance. But it's a balance in tension that constantly goes back and forth and vacillates. We understand at the end of the day that Christians owe Caesar something, just not everything. And it's true for us as freedom-loving Americans, but it's also true for the communist Chinese who fear every day that they gather in their house churches underground that the government's going to burst in and arrest them. Governments will answer to God for what they do. But so will I. So what do we do here? I think first and foremost, we always need discernment. We need discernment when we consider the things that we're asked to do or need to do. And some are easy. We can read Romans 13. We can read 2 Peter 2 and look at those things and say, okay, there's some things that pay your taxes, do certain things. That's great. It's easy. But things aren't always that cut and dry either. To what extent do we obey the emperor? Worship, obviously, too much. Deny the deity of Christ, too much. But where do we draw the lines? Are there times in which we have to violate certain things and mandates and issues or not? Obviously, we can't violate Scripture. Some aspects, I think, fall into areas of Christian liberty where we need to consider certain things and realize that some people come across with a different understanding or a different opinion on some things than others. You can't sin against your conscience. When we look at those things, like, okay, what do we do here? But use discernment. Think through these things. And we might come away with disagreeing on the matter. Then follow your conscience and respect those that disagree. But it can take discernment. It can take wrestling through something. We need to take the time to do that. Again, never forget that government does derive its authority from God. We find that really taking place for the first time in Genesis 9. If you kill someone, by man shall you be killed. You shall be taken out. That was something that was given to Noah right after the flood. But it was this establishment of some semblance of government. It was simple and it was small and it was relatively easy to do and acknowledge, like, has it been broken or not. But we had this beginnings here where God's establishing this government that wasn't just for Noah and his family. It was for everybody that's descending on that. We realize it's the foundations for what later became called and thought of as government. A ruling body to be able to do that, to be able to exercise justice. It comes from God. And truly, governments keep the world from being as evil and wicked as it could be. We realize that some are a lot better at that than others. There's probably very few times, although there probably has been few times, where no government would have been better than that government. But it's rare. We also have to remember, especially in our country, because of the way that it works, that when we talk about government, we're talking about many, many offices, many, many individuals that are there. And there are certainly some good, genuine believers that are there in offices, from the very lowest, all the way to the top. There's places, they're all throughout there. There are genuine believers that are there, the Christians. They're trying to live out their faith. They're trying to truly do the best they possibly can for the country. We can easily just look at government and just almost spit out the side of our mouth. I get it. We have to be careful that there's good people in there. Not all. But there are some good people in there. And they're trying to live out their faith and be a witness. We can't ever forget that. We also need to pray for our leaders in every segment. I know that feels like, we just throw that in there, because we should say that. But no, look, seriously. We really should. I would not want really any of those jobs. Would you? Oh, man, I just can't imagine waking up every day and like, I got to do this again? Really? I would hate it. Now, some of them, of course, are power hungry. Some of them probably do love and relish the fact that they get to tell people what to do and all the other stuff, the nonsense that comes along with it. Probably. We can pray about that too, though. Pray that, because they do need our prayers. Sincerely pray that they find Christ. To sincerely pray that they do the right thing. That they rule and legislate rightly and well. You think about the Old Testament, how many times God used countless pagan kings to accomplish His will. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, comes to mind, especially in the early days when there's no reason to think that he was a believer whatsoever, and yet God used him. But Cyrus would be another one. And I've never really heard anybody make an argument that Cyrus was a believer. And yet God used him to restore the nation of Israel and to rebuild the temple. He was a pagan. If God's done it in the past, can he do it again? I think we have to entertain that idea like he can. We might be surprised. We also have to understand that choices come with consequences. And if we get to a point that we cannot do good, and we have to look at somebody and say, I can't do this. We have to go against whatever it happens to be. We understand that that comes with consequences. All I'm really trying to say is just understand you're not immune. You're not immune. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that you're not going to suffer. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that God is going to protect you from the ramifications that are coming along with something like this. It doesn't mean that. You think about how many times that Christians died or lost everything for the cause of Christ because they would not bow down to the emperor. They would not defy the edicts of Christ and the gospel, and they would not bow down. They're asking, bow down to the emperor, show your allegiance to Rome, show us that you're in our favor. They couldn't do it. And they still died. They faced the lions. They faced tumult. They faced and they lost so much. We're not immune from those kinds of things. And just because you're suffering doesn't mean like I made the wrong choice, made the wrong decision. No, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't. Governments are not perfect. I feel like I can't say that enough. Because I probably can't. But they're not. But rather than overthrowing them, Jesus commends us to try as much as we can to live in harmony with them. They are doing some, not all, but some good. Even if sometimes we have to squint to see it. I don't know about you, but sometimes my eyes are getting awful tired trying to squint to see it. On the other hand, the part of this statement that Jesus makes that we often forget here is the question, are you offering to God or rendering to God the things that are His? Are you worshiping? Are you keeping His law? Are you supporting the brethren? We can spend so much time on what do I have to do or not do for the government. Where are the lines? Where are the details? I can't tell you those things. You have to discern those for yourself. You have to think through those for yourself. But we sometimes fail to consider, what does God want? And not even in light of the government. What does just God want from me? What does rendering to God the things that are God's mean for me today? What am I supposed to give? What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to think? How can I render to God the things that are His? We don't all walk around with Roman coins in our pockets. But we do carry the image of God with us everywhere we go. Do others recognize what they see in us as the image of God? Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank You for this day as we considered this kind of a non-popular, shall we call it, text. Lord, I think as we think through this, we all can think very, very quickly the shortcomings and failings, the violations and abuses that our government and countless other governments have done throughout history. The amount of blood that is on their hands is terrible. And Lord, we probably want to know the half of it. And yet, Lord, You are calling us to render to Caesar the things that are His, that there are certain things that He does have a right to claim. Lord, that's not really an easy pill to swallow. I don't like it. I doubt anyone here does. And yet we realize that we do have to live life in tension. We are still here in this world, even though we're looking forward to being citizens of the next, or we are citizens of the next, but we're looking forward to actually being there, living there. Lord, help us to live well. Help us to use discernment. Lord, I just honestly just pray for our leaders. There's honestly too many to count. I think even on a small scale, the mayor of Greenwood, I think I rarely pray for him. but there is an influence that he has in this town, a detail and responsibilities that he carries on his shoulders. And Lord, I pray that you would be with him. I pray that you would help him to do his job and execute his duties well and faithfully. I pray for the various senators and congressmen on a local level of the state of Wisconsin. I wish I could remember all their names, and I know they can't. But again, Lord, these are trying times. Tumultuous times for sure. And regardless of the letter that comes before or after their name, many of them need Christ. They need to be saved. Lord, they have a hard and difficult job to do, and we understand that regardless of what they do, nobody's going to be happy. At least not everybody. It's hard. Lord, I pray you would help them to do and execute their jobs faithfully. I pray for our president and the president-elect. Lord, we realize the amount of tension that hangs there right now. Lord, we all know what we want to see happen. We don't know what will happen. Lord, I pray that regardless of who happens to hold that office for the next 4 years, that you would work through them, that they would come to Christ, that they would rule well, legislate rightly, and be faithful to the office. Lord, I know for myself it's so easy to just complain about situations and things that I don't like. And it's right to have conversation and talk and discuss and even to share opinions. We learn. But Lord, I also need to uphold them before you, to pray for them. And I pray, Lord, this coming year you would help me to do exactly that thing, to pray for them, that you would work through them, regardless of who they happen to be. Lord, we're thankful for this constant reminder and for the tension, that we might see it and recognize it for what it is, and render to each accordingly as you would have us to, executing our responsibilities to each in a way that will glorify you. In Christ's name, amen.